All right, welcome everybody to our virtual talk today with Dr. Kathryn Angelica. We're excited to have her here. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction and we'll get going. Kathryn Angelica is currently a visiting assistant professor in United States history at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. She received her PhD from the University of Connecticut and holds graduate certificate in feminist studies, college instruction, and race, ethnicity, and politics. Her book, Manuscript in Progress, Their Mighty Influence, 19th Century Black and White Women's Activist Networks, explores the way social movements intersected and intervened to reveal the impact, tensions, and complexity of generational change. And we are excited. Kathryn was a former NERC fellow for VHS in New England. And so we had her in our archives at one point. And so we're excited to have her back to talk today about women's activism during the Civil War. So with that, I will turn it over to her.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Eileen for inviting me to talk to you all today to participate in this virtual speaker series. It is always exciting to have the opportunity to talk about something that is so interesting to you personally, related to your own research. As professional historians, we don't always have the opportunity to share our research, so it's an incredible kind of gift to have the time to speak with you all today. So I look forward to kind of delving into this topic. I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation going. When I was given the opportunity here to speak today, I was thinking about what topic I wanted to address. And as Eileen said, my current book manuscript based on my dissertation is very much focused on the exploring the complexities between white and Black women's activism in the 19th century, thinking about the way that the archive in particular is organized around kind of restricted and limited sources. How do we as historians access the full breadth and range of information about women's activism in this period? And because I'm also currently teaching, or I guess now that it's finals week, it's over, but taught this semester a course on the Civil War era, I was brought back to the portion of my book manuscript that examines not only particularly how women are engaging in these movements in the Civil War period, but also the ways in which that activism is reflecting new concepts of patriotism, linking that activism to new ideas of citizenship, to Americanness in this period. And so I wanted to, in particular, talk about women's activism in this period by focusing on the diversity, complexity, and varied nature of what that looks like in this period. So I titled my talk "Patriotic Fervor: Women's Activism During the Civil War." Before I get into the main focus of this project, which will be emphasizing in particular home front activism, I did just want to talk about this image very briefly on my title slide. This is a ribbon badge worn by a woman volunteer at the Great Central Fair in Philadelphia in 1864. We'll talk about sanitary fairs a little bit in this talk. This woman, who is identified only by the initials RD, worked in the retail grocery department. She also hosted her own table in the restaurant department. So if you were a fair goer, you could sit down at one of these tables. It would be staffed by a woman, maybe family members of that woman. She would have include her own cutlery and dishes, prepare her own food, and you could have a home cooked meal. So she took part in those aspects of the fair. But I also just wanted to emphasize the kind of symbolic and performative value of this badge. Red, white, and blue. It has the cornet. It's got the eagle, the stars, all of these patriotic symbols that are accompanying what is largely, in her role, a kind of domestic tasks and labor that are being performed in support of the Union war effort. So thinking about ways in which women's patriotism is emerging in this period, who can take advantage and represent themselves as patriotic in this period. Largely that is restricted to white women activists. And how do we kind of engage with these ideas of patriotism in this period? All right. So we are in October of 1864, at the height of the American Civil War, and hundreds of Bostonians are flocking to the Mercantile Hall on Sumner Street to attend a fair for the benefit of disabled and sick African American soldiers. This was an event organized by a society titled the Colored Ladies Sanitary Commission of Boston, and they urged the patronage of the public to support men who had, quote, fought bravely to sustain our noble flag and the country's freedom, end quote. Fairgoers were first met by a large banner draped across Sumner Street, along with a panoply of red, white, and blue. The inside of the hall was likewise decorated with stars and stripes, drawing the eye in particular to a portrait of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the white commander of the first regiment formed of African American troops in the North in the United States during the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts. This painting was created by African American artist Edward Ann Bannister. And the women of the fair framed this painting with embroidered letters spelling "Our Martyr." For 25 cents admission price, one could peruse tables filled with useful and ornamental objects, often with patriotic slogans written on them. Could make a selection of cakes and confectionaries. Try your luck at the raffle. You could win among those prizes Bannister's painting, a Hamlin cabinet organ, and also a Chickering's piano. On one evening, fairgoers could hear a speech given by Anna Dickinson, famed orator in this period. She was a teenage phenomenon, the first woman to speak before kind of address Congress in this period, to make a political speech. She also came and gave a patriotic speech during this 3-day long affair. The fair ultimately raised over $3,000 for disabled soldiers of color and their families. And the patriotic display over this 3-day period was only possible due to the organization, labor, and initiative of Boston's women of color. However, as scholars have demonstrated, the ways in which the Civil War have reframed the context in which activists have engaged with the federal government, have framed their activism. It largely does not express and represent the labors of women of color. So scholars have explored the ways that the Civil War acted as a catalyst to push women into public spaces, to legitimize labors that had beforehand not been seen as political or patriotic during the war effort. In my book manuscript, I talk about the ways in which the Civil War provided a platform for seasoned activists and reformers to demonstrate and enact political citizenship claims, as well as providing new opportunities and ways for women to participate in these political and patriotic endeavors. Many white reformers took part in organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission, the United States Christian Commission, the Women's National Loyal League, the last of which was formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who largely made this argument that women's rights activists should pause their labors to focus on supporting the Union war effort, to focus on abolition and emancipation, and then later to resume those women's rights concerns. But these records do not indicate the breadth and scope of the ways in which women of color, particularly Black women in the northern states, are participating in the Union war effort. And where they do emerge, they are largely painted only as auxiliaries, as helpmeets, as contributors to these organizations, and not as folks who are initiating, forming, and enacting unique forms of activism, political citizenship claims through these records. They're largely studied, the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, these organizations, but they do not provide the breadth and scope. So what we do know is that Black women throughout New England enacted parallel wartime labors that leveraged interregional networks, so networks connecting towns, cities, and states, a grassroots organization to do things like support African American troops and regiments, their families, free communities in the South, refugees from slavery, and also just broadly the Union War effort. And what we see when we look at the pieces of information that we can gather outside of these broad records and organizations is that they imbued their activism with multifaceted and forward-thinking goals. Unlike Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had, to some extent, the privilege of saying we can pause our endeavors during the war to kind of focus on this broader effort. Black women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Harriet Tubman, these other figures could not separate feminist women's rights concerns from civil rights, emancipation, abolition concerns, that these were intertwined goals. And so when we look at women's activism in this period, one of the things that I have to remind my students, remind myself, is to not think of women as a universal category, that we have to be incredibly conscious about the diversity of race, of gender, of class, of a status of freedom, of education, of literacy, all of these things that impact the ways in which women are able to enact their activism. Another thing that we talk about extensively and I think about critically in my research is how we define activism. Do we define activism only as participation in a society or an organization with a kind of a transformative goal, like a suffrage society or a civil rights society or an abolition society? Or do we adopt a more expansive notion of activism that encompasses self-preservation, resistance, self-emancipation, combating racism and discrimination that folks are forced to engage in because of the environments and circumstances they find themselves in? That they're not engaging in activism as a kind of a career endeavor or as a kind of supplemental aspect of their life, but as this central mode of survival in their life. So really thinking about the range of activism, what activism can mean in United States history. The study of Black women's activism in particular forces us to implement strategies to find, reframe, and reposition the surviving sources that we do have, while recognizing the limitations of those sources. So whether our records and examples of Black women's activism in the Sanitary Commission, the Christian Commission, they are very limited examples. So in my work and in my book manuscript, I have used microhistorical and Black feminist methodologies in an attempt to gain insight into the experience of women of color, particularly in instances we do not have, reports, annual reports, letters, financial records of these societies and organizations. An important aspect of my work also has been exploring local and community archives, when they are and where they are available, in particular historically Black churches. Unfortunately, many Black churches have throughout the end of the 19th century and early 20th century been forced to move locations, typically from a center city location to an outer city location, that has required often loss of documents. Many churches that I've examined have experienced fires at some point, either purposely set as an attack on Black community members or as a structural issue, money and cost and things happen, which meant that many records are lost. So really becoming an expert at using fragments to reconstruct what African American women's labor has looked like, what that activism looked like, in order to reframe these histories of activism. So we're going to be looking at some of those fragments today as well. And although today, this talk, I am not going to be focusing on the South, the front lines of the Civil War, and really going to be focusing in New England, Boston, Philadelphia, New York. I did just want to allude to the reality that the history of women's activism also encompasses more than what is happening on the home front and more than what I'm going to be talking about today. I am not going to be talking, example, about activism on the front lines, women who work as nurses, as soldiers, as spies, as informants, particularly as well the activism resistance that we can see amongst enslaved people who are seeking freedom, running into Union lines, who are refugees of war, working as laundresses, as cooks, as attendants, as laborers, as farmers, to support the Union Army in various ways. Activists, African American activists, including Reverend Leonard Grimes, who is obviously not a woman, but very closely connected with with Black women's activism in Boston as pastor of the 12th Baptist Church. His wife, Octavia Grimes, who unfortunately very few records of her life, was critically involved in these organizations. Marianne Shadd Cary, who traveled to Canada, moved to Canada in the 1850s, started a newspaper, worked as an army recruiter for the Union Army. Harriet Tubman, obviously the most, I would say, obviously, maybe the most famous example of Black women's activism in the Civil War, worked as a nurse, a spy, an informant, and of course, famously also led a battle herself as commander, in which she freed several hundred enslaved people. So critically important figures that move beyond this home front activism. But today we're going to be focusing largely on the role of home front activism in these instances, particularly in these public fundraising endeavors, sanitary fairs, fairs in general in the Civil War, that are allowing women to demonstrate their participation in the Civil War. I mentioned earlier there were several organizations that formed in the Civil War, 1861, early 1862, to support the Union War effort and the home front effort. Particularly these organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission, the United States Christian Commission, are focused on supporting enlisted men in various ways. The United States Sanitary Commission, a federally sanctioned organization that was created in 1861, focused on the health of soldiers. So sanitaire, French health, kind of focused on, are they eating enough? Are they clothed? Is there a medical, do they have enough medicine and medical intervention? The ways in which women could support that by knitting socks. There was a phase where women were knitting things called havelocks, which would kind of cover the dust of a face, protect the face, which ultimately proved to be not that helpful. Making sure that they had nutrients, also comforts from home. Jellies and puddings and cakes and things like that. Agents of the Sanitary Commission also traveled and visited, provided battlefield relief and support, care for the wounded, inspected the health of troops in the army, and also prisoners of war in POW camps, and also attempted to prevent the spread of disease, which was a major killer in this period as well. But what these organizations largely did, whether they are the Sanitary Commission or the Christian Commission or more regional organizations, was to attempt to systematize the benevolent labors and activism of women on the home front, so that if you are a small organization or a Soldiers' Aid Society or sewing society formed in Vermont, and of course you want to send your cakes and jellies and supplies directly to Vermont soldiers, that may not be the troop or the regiment with the most need, who maybe there are other battles that are taking place and they're not at that battle. So the purpose of these organizations was to kind of systematize and create a bureaucracy of support so that aid, comfort, whatever it was, bandages, clothing, etc., went to troops that needed it the most, and not just to Vermont folks sending it to Vermont folks or Connecticut folks sending it to their regiments. And so this was complex. There's a much longer history also about the strategies, whether they paid volunteers, whether they were unpaid. Christian Commission obviously emphasized spiritual well-being as well as physical well-being. and kind of shifted how they are forming that activism. Sanitary fairs or fundraising fairs that took place in the Civil War. We have an image on the left of the screen from Harper's Weekly, which is a drawing of the tents of the Great Central Fair in Philadelphia in 1864. The image on the right is a photograph of the main hall of the fair. And we can just see how many flags, banners, displays. We can imagine if this were a color photograph, how impressive it would be to walk through, what emotions you may feel seeing this in the midst of a civil war as well. These fairs, which were organized in the Civil War period, drew on a longer tradition of fundraising fairs as a mode of fundraising available to women, where they could produce items, handkerchiefs, clothing, paintings, etc., that used domestic skills or wares in order to raise money for various causes, particularly the abolitionist cause, used fundraising fairs as a method. During the Civil War, they transform into these incredibly extensive patriotic endeavors. And again, thinking about the image on our right in particular, the way in which kind of the impressive nature of these fairs was visible to fair goers. And if you were to go to the Great Central Fair in Philadelphia, for example, you could walk through a manufacturing hall, see all of these top of the line technological equipment, agricultural equipment. You could walk through a curiosity shop and see kind of interesting mystical items. They had various forms of entertainment, dining rooms, art galleries, music playing. Oftentimes, they would include displays of flags captured in battle, artifacts, American artifacts. Sometimes they would include symbolism like chains that had held enslaved people. Artifacts from Lincoln's life would be displayed, other presidents, other political figures, and things like that. So incredibly kind of engaging in this period. And those that worked at these fairs were able to also demonstrate their patriotism in different ways. Primarily, folks who were involved in the organization of these fairs were middle class and upper class folks, particularly white women. It is a lesser known site of African American activism and patriotism. But one of the things that I have explored in my research are the ways in which Black men and women are participating and contributing to these broader patriotic endeavors, as well as creating and organizing their own organizations and fairs with political and patriotic goals. So one of the things that I talk about, and I think it's important to recognize as well, is when we were looking at the records of these organizations, we see reports of committee members, folks who were, president, treasurer, elected officers, folks who contributed money to these organizations, in the financial records and the treasury reports, folks who were part of these local organizations. What we don't see as clearly people who are participating in these fairs and making them possible by working as porters, as clerks, as restaurant attendants, as janitors in this period, in offices, as laborers. So as many boxes and materials arrived, they had to be carried, opened, organized, sorted, and delivered to different places. And largely those roles and labor was performed by African American men and women in this period. So I want to talk briefly about a few examples of African American labor that supported these broad patriotic endeavors. The image on the left is taken from the records of the New England Women's Auxiliary Association. The records are held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, but this organization encompassed Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, New England states in this period. Connecticut was part of the New York branch of the Sanitary Commission. And so encompass like the labor of New England more broadly. And Elias Richards appears in the photograph album associated with this organization, and he had worked as a porter for the offices. He is posed here with a necktie, vest, and white jacket, and received a salary for hauling, sorting, and transporting heavy boxes of supplies and other errands. On the right, we see an image of the waiters in the restaurant department or the large dining room of the Great Central Fair in 1864. And this is one of the only images that shows that predominantly shows people of color who are working and participating in the fair. The photograph collection, which is extensive and fascinating, it is digitized. You can look through it on the Library Company of Philadelphia's website. Largely shows white women and men kind of posed and standing before these extravagant patriotic displays. This image is one of the only images that shows the labor of Black men, in particular in this image, in the fair. Now, in the history of the fair, written by Charles Stille, Stille mocked what he called, quote, the very important air assumed by these men, quote, as if the success of the fair depended on the individual exertions of each, end quote. And I emphasize this quote in particular to kind of force us to think about the ways in which contemporary histories of these organizations are shaping our impressions of Black labor. He's mocking that they are engaged, passionate about their participation in this fair, and not recognizing them as patriotic contributors to this process, reducing them and minimizing their contributions to menial labor, and not to these broader expressions of patriotism that are being expressed by white laborers. Very briefly, I also just wanted to mention that often at sanitary fairs, the entertainment that was offered also positioned people of color as spectacles, and as the entertainment as well for fairgoers. Tickets to the fair and to these various events were priced at a kind of progressive level. You could pay more and get more, but also purposely to allow even poorer folks or working class folks to attend. If you were to attend, you could also see minstrel shows, so individuals with blackface performing during these fairs. In the New York Fair, Metropolitan Fair, you could attend the Knickerbocker Kitchen, which is displayed on the right-hand side of the screen, which is styled after what they refer to as early life in the state. So you could go and sit in a parlor and be served by Black servants and attendants, listen to music performed by African American men and women. And you could also attend, as the image on the left suggests or demonstrates, the Indian department, where Indigenous people appeared in traditional costumes to dance and sing. They listed, for example, the war dance and the scalp dance as features. One of the descriptions I think is interesting to note referred to the quote unquote muscular savagery of these men, as well as the quote strangely weird vocal melodies of their performances. So thinking about the ways in which Native American culture is displayed as a spectacle, as exotic, as weirdly strange, as they use the phrase, but also the display of Native American bodies, of people, also African American people, is part of the entertainment and spectacle. And largely what these displays and entertainments are doing are romanticizing Native American life, antebellum life, where slavery is part of American society. And what is ironic and strange about these patriotic spaces is that both of these displays, kind of the romanticization of Indigenous life that they are deeming as fading away, and of antebellum life of African American slavery, also they are deeming as fading away, while they are simultaneously celebrating images like this one which is a kind of a more famous image created by Thomas Nast, who was a political cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, an illustrated newspaper, which are also kind of celebrating the age of anti-slavery and emancipation. So the turn of the Civil War by 1864 to be focusing not only on the reforming of the Union, but the emancipation of slavery and the abolition of 3 to 4 millions of people who are living in a state of slavery. So fairgoers are looking at this image, which is juxtaposing on the left-hand side the past. So we have images of violence, of slave auctions, of whipping, of slave hunting. And on the right-hand side, we see voting, going to school, families, freedom, education, the future of emancipation and freedom, the idealized, hoped future, not so much accomplished, of what emancipation would be. So these are, kind of critical spaces that are engaging in profiting off of their romanticization and enjoyment of an age passing away, but also kind of looking for this future. And it is unclear how people of color are going to fit into, both of these spaces. Now, people of color in northern cities made attempts to both publicly participate in efforts, fundraising efforts of organizations like the Sanitary Fair, on equal footing with white volunteers, as well as organizing their own societies. They were often rebuffed in their attempts to participate. So, for example, in the preparations for the Great Central Fair in Philadelphia, uh, uh, Black community members and organizers like William D. Forton, who was a recruiter for African American regiments in this period, wrote to committee members of the fair asking if Black women could participate, could furnish their own table, could have a display, an exhibit at the fair, and he was told that this was not possible. The prompt response from Welsh, which is exhibited, or the letter on the left is Fortin's letter to Welsh, who was the chairman of the executive committee of the fair, requesting Black women have the ability to participate, denied that Black women could do so. Largely on grounds that they weren't accepting additional tables at that point in exhibits. This is not really the case. They were kind of creating this, slowly and ad hoc throughout the time. But what this letter and decision does was ensure that when you walked into the Sanitary Fair display, that you were seeing only white women staffing these tables. I also just really like to show the example on the right. This is an ad in periodicals spread at the time to kind of advertise for the fair and get supporters and volunteers to participate. And what this advertisement is demonstrating is what uniform, and they say lady volunteers, using the word ladies, a term typically barred from identifying Black women, reserved for white women, and outlines the kind of the racial division and kind of an ironic, unintended double entendre in this image. So it proclaims white bodies as being both serviceable and becoming. So unintended double entendre painted both the picture of the intended costume of women volunteers, but also invokes this image and vision of white women in white dresses staffing rows of tables draped in red, white, and blue. So this uniform or a patriotic shield that white women wore to participate in these fairs, unlike that patriotic shield worn by white women, Black laborers who were largely told to dress in unassuming ways, marked them as servants, as non-participants, as laborers, and the exclusion of Black women from these spaces, from active participation as volunteers, not only refused them space on the fairgrounds to exhibit their organizations, which did exist, I'll talk about it in a moment, but also denied them the right to profess their patriotism in a public forum, to exhibit themselves as patriotic, often relegating them to anonymous contributions. But we're not offered this opportunity to be symbols of patriotic benevolence. So in this slide, I wanted to share some of the fragments that have helped me to piece together the ways in which Black women are participating in Civil War activism in this period. What we know from examining cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, is that African American women are forming their own organizations, soldiers' aid societies, sewing circles, freedmen's aid societies, community support, recruiting organizations for the Union Army, but also sometimes organizations that use the phrase sanitary commission in their title. For example, the St. Thomas Committee on the top right was referred to as the Ladies Sanitary Committee. And we also have the Colored Women's Loyal Union League on the bottom left in Pennsylvania. And largely what we know about these organizations comes from newspaper articles, scraps of paper. The top left is the back of a scrap of paper in a larger collection of the Brown family in Worcester, Massachusetts, which just states, received from Mrs. Brown $5 from the Ladies Sanitary Fund. And we know that Martha A. Brown was an African American woman in Worcester. We have no information about what the Ladies Sanitary Fund was, if it was an interracial organization, if it was a Black women's organization in Worcester, or who was our participant of it. So these tiny, tiny fragments of information. On the bottom right, we see members of the organization called the Colored Ladies Relief Society, also based in the 12th Baptist Church, presenting regimental colors to the 54th Massachusetts. So, kind of alluding to other ways in which women's organization, women activists participated in public forums. So in this patriotic kind of event of sending a regiment off to battle, presenting them with colors, presenting a flag, performing poems, and other kind of speeches and symbolic performances as other ways that Black women could participate. Okay. But just to end, to kind of wrap up, I wanted to give an example of one of these organizations, come back to our Colored Ladies Sanitary Commission of Boston. This is an organization that was founded by Black women leaders in Boston within the historically abolitionist 12th Baptist Church. The image below in the center is when it was located on Joy Street in Boston, a long period before it moved elsewhere. The president of the organization was a African American and Indigenous woman named Christiana Carto Bannister, who, under the moniker Madame Carto, owned a series of salons that stretched between Providence and Boston. She was an entrepreneur, an abolitionist, a property holder, and also the wife of Edward Bannister, was a painter. And so we have this kind of lovely painting of her, image of her, that is held at the RISD Museum in Rhode Island. And what I wanted to talk about particularly with this organization in Boston, who organized that fair that I talked about in the beginning in 1864, was the way in which the ads published by these organizations contained overtly political slogans that reflected the unique activist foundations of African American women in this period. So these are organizations that took part in these public presentations to the 54th and 50th regiments, African American regiments from Massachusetts. They highlight in particular the bravery and sacrifice of Black soldiers in this period. So on the left, we see particular they have been in our country's service, received no pay. Hundreds of them have fallen in defense of the flag, leaving in their midst their poor, suffering, and destitute wives and children. African American soldiers enlisted in the Union Army were paid half the rate of white soldiers. They were placed in the least least attractive positions, largely used as laborers, given the lowest quality clothing, medical attention, and largely did not receive pay until 1865, about a year or 2 years into their service. They were also far more likely to be captured if they lost, to be captured by Confederate troops and sold into slavery. And there are also many examples of African American troops who are slaughtered instead of being allowed to surrender in battle. So what this organization is doing is also highlighting the mistreatment of Black soldiers, as well as recognizing the patriotism and sacrifice of Black families and community members who are supporting those enlisted men. And African American men, and there were over 2,000 African American men who served in the Union Army. Sorry, 200,000, what am I saying? 200,000 African men that served in the Union Army. And they disproportionately enlisted as compared to white soldiers. So a higher percentage of the Black community enlists and serves, despite only being allowed to enlist between 1863 and 1865 in this period. Also, in these appeals, they make reference to the unholy rebellion of not this particular one, but different ads of the slave power. They talk about universal freedom. They talk about the future of the United States, and really think about this possibility of extending rights, citizenship, and opportunities also to the women as well as men. And Boston organization called for money for the military effort. They sent committee members south to visit hospitals and visit people freed from slavery and refugees, raised money for orphaned children of color in this period, formed fugitives aid societies and freedmen's aid societies, and kind of aligned these patriotic efforts with these broader calls for anti-slavery abolition and civil rights in this period. Activist women, in particular Black women, leveraged church meeting rooms, front parlors, street corners to raise funds for these social and political causes. Their work included church organizations, soldiers' aid societies, relief societies, and paved the way for the Reconstruction period. Their efforts also include, in contrast to labors of white women in Sanitary Commission and other organizations, efforts to dismantle institutionalized racism, segregation, and exclusion. And their activism demonstrates the ways women of color used local organization and patriotic displays not only as tools to raise funds, but also to underscore their own citizenship claims in this period as the wives, families of men who had sacrificed for the support of the Union Army and the nation. Examining their work and thinking about women's activism from this broad perspective allows us to think about the ways activists use spectacle in the distribution of public appeals, in the organization of fairs, in the presenting of regimental colors, presenting themselves, their own bodies, as patriotic symbols in this period. It's new ways to think about how women advanced claims for emancipation, community support, civil rights, and their own political participation in this period. And I hope also kind of reframes how we think about, women's activism and Civil War activism in this period. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. So I am more than happy to take questions, to hear responses from this, to address anything I have time to address. Yeah, I will turn it back over to Eileen.
Great. Thank you so much. So again, you can feel free to use the Q&A to submit a question or put a question in the chat, or I see Elise has raised her hand. So let me unmute you, Elise, and ask your question.
Okay, I guess I'm unmuted. Good. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk. I have a question about very early on, you said that women were pushed into public spaces which of course connotes that they didn't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, that they just wanted to stay home and be in their domestic spaces, where of course there are a lot of Black women who were never able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. I'm sure there were women that were really happy to be out in public spaces and that
Mm-hmm.
everybody wasn't pushed into it. Could you talk
Mm-hmm.
about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that there are, first of all, many women who, we have to break down this kind of, both in academia, but also kind of in cultural understanding of the separate sphere idea, where women are restricted to a home environment, do not have access to these other spaces, primarily because of the reality that working class women, immigrant women, and women of color, both freeborn women of color and, of course, enslaved women, do not have the option of kind of maintaining a separate sphere. And that is something that, of course, continues into the 20th century and today. And we think about kind of arguments or feminist arguments in labor in this period. The increased presence of women in public spaces, again, has to reflect the diversity of these kind of class and race concerns. So, for example, you do have figures like Mary Livermore in Chicago, who becomes the director of the regional branch, the Northwestern regional branch, which is based in Chicago, who insists, for example, that she receive a salary to support someone to take care of her children and take care of her household while she is working. And she's one of those figures who, during the Civil War, does kind of talk about this as like, oh, like I have to go out and do these things. She also is one of the figures that talks about the Civil War as this turning point for her. She reflects in her memoirs of moments where, as she is organizing the Chicago Fair, being denied, her signature is denied on a contract. Because the construction manager, the contractor, says, "I must have your husband's signature," and she points to that moment as like the final straw. She reflects back on that when she's writing the 1880s, of this final straw that demonstrated to her that the way that society was organized did not adequately provide women with rights and access. Of course, the pushback to that would be that she is in her 40s at this point, and of course must have realized or encountered these limitations prior to this point, or was in a position of privilege that allowed her to still function with independence and autonomy despite those limitations in ways that Black women and women of color and working class women cannot do in this period. So when I say and talk about women being kind of pushed into public spaces, I didn't mean to imply so much that they were doing so against their will in this period, although there are folks like Mary Livermore who are kind of framing it as reluctant and trying to avoid kind of the criticism that women received in this period for stepping into male-dominated spaces by making speeches or participating in public forums. But to talk about the ways in which they are legitimizing their participation in those spaces in different ways. Many working class women, for example, or poor women, were forced to become breadwinners when their husbands went off to war, were killed, were widowed, and things like that. We also see more women who are emerging as orators, as speakers, as lecturers in the Civil War and post-Civil War period, who are pushing back against, claims that it is not ladylike to do so, who are pushing back against claims that they should not be part of those conversations. These are larger processes. So, thinking about Lucretia Mott being, told to sit behind a curtain at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London versus participating because she was a woman. It's like, oh, we can't participate in this. I, in my research, push back against the idea that the Civil War kind of opened the eyes of women activists to concerns about gender inequality. I think this is kind of marginalizes and minimizes the longer networks and kind of generational change in activism that is taking place in the 19th century. We do see a shift where there are more women entering these public spaces, and figures like Anna Dickinson, who are sensationalized, who are not speaking kind of in these traditional, domestically noted feminine ways, but about political matters. She's criticizing the government. She's participating in Republican kind of ideology in this period, and that is kind of shifting in kind of the public consciousness of how women can participate in different ways. But of course, it's very much limited, as you point out, by race, gender, class, access. Who can afford to take that risk, and to kind of survive the charges of not ladylike behavior, et cetera, that are pressed against them. So absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, Jacqueline, it looks like I just asked you to unmute. There you go.
I have a question. I read a book about the colored women who are spies in the Civil War, those who were African, and those who were so mixed race and so white looking that they could serve as either white or black in their spying. And could you comment on that? And the other thing that we had read, and when we went on our Civil War trips, is the Sanitary Commission realized that the bandages have to be boiled and dried for the men to survive when they were reused. That was one thing. And they also realized that the men did better if they had fresh fruit, which was a source of vitamin C. But they didn't realize infection wasn't really known at that point. And yet the Sanitary Commission realized the men survived better if the bandages were boiled. But could you comment on the women of color acting as spies in the Civil War?
Yes, absolutely. And your comment about the kind of medical interventions that the Sanitary Commission contributed to reminds me to, the reason why I never, if given the hypothetical question, where would you travel? Where would you time travel to if you go anywhere else? My general answer is not the Civil War era, because the medical interventions are harrowing. Absolutely. So, they observed access to things like fresh fruit to eliminate scurvy, men who were, given surgical intervention, who were the first of the day and had clean instruments, were far more likely to survive because of the spread of bacteria, as well as reusing bandages and materials. A lot of the supplies sent by Sanitary Commission packages included things like bedding and fluff for wounds, strips of fabric for bandages, because the Civil War, every single battle was a record-setting battle of number of people killed, wounded, or injured, and so they could not keep up with the number of people who were injured. Gettysburg, 30,000 people are killed in a 3-day period, just overwhelming number of people dead. Black women who are working as spies, informants. This is an incredibly fascinating aspect of the Civil War. It plays on assumptions and prejudices of the 19th century, gendered and race prejudices and assumptions made that both women and the people of color or enslaved people are not threats. So one of the things that happened during the Civil War in particular was that Confederate troops would bring enslaved workers with them to Confederate camps, and often they would have personal attendants come with them to the front lines and to the battlefield. So that meant when enslaved people, men and women, escaped into Union lines, they not only, escaped into Union lines and offered whatever physical labor they could provide in support of the war. They also said, well, I was in the room when Commander so-and-so was talking about where the troops are going to go next, and I heard them say that they are planning on doing this or that. Famously, Robert Smalls took control of a Confederate vessel and drove it into Union lines with other enslaved people on board. A ship. On that ship were war plans and maps that outlined Confederate movements. And in the same way as you identify, there were many enslaved people or formerly enslaved people who risked their life and potential safety to act as spies and informants because of the assumption that they were not threats to kind of sharing this information, particularly women who were workers. And so this is a really fascinating aspect of the Civil War, and it's one of those things that historians have kind of emphasized more recently as a way to emphasize that formerly enslaved people are not merely fleeing for safety or fleeing into Union lines and having freedom bestowed upon them, but were crucial strategic elements to the success of the Union Army. They're bringing not only whatever information that they are hearing or overhearing from Confederate commanders, but also understanding of the geography of the South. Many Northern commanders were not familiar with the rivers and hills and environments of Virginia or South Carolina or Louisiana. They know how to the best way to navigate those spaces. They understand foodways and herbs and medicine and things like that. These are critical to the success of the Union Army, and are one of the many fascinating kind of new ways of thinking about the way that African American people, both enslaved and free, are contributing to the success. So absolutely, Harriet Tubman is one of those folks who worked as a spy in this period, and brought information back to Union forces. She also worked as a nurse. She led a command herself. And there are several other kind of examples of Black women who are taking on these roles. Absolutely fascinating aspect of this period.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathryn. So I think we have time for probably one more question. So again, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. If we don't see one, I'll have one last one if nobody else goes. All right. So lots of wonderful things in here. I guess one of my questions, you talk about the sanitary commissions as sort of centralizing the distribution of the materials, and then all of Black soldiers being given kind of the worst sort of parts of the war. Was there an even distribution to the Black troops from white sanitary commissions, or was there segregation even within that as well? Do you know?
So largely what we know from the records is that although both the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission did extend support and aid to African American troops, that it was a kind of secondary to white troops, but also to troops that were in uh, uh, more immediate battle. It's not till 1864 that Black troops are actually allowed to participate in battle. So most famously, the 54th Massachusetts, the attack on Fort Wagner. Majority of them are killed. It's the subject of the film Glory. And it's been kind of memorialized in that way. The Fort Pillow massacre. There were hundreds of major battles that African American regiments take part in, but because they are largely relegated from kind of mid 1863 to that period to menial labor, to digging trenches, kind of guarding different areas, to occupying different spaces. They are given the least amount of support and the worst uniforms, shoes, weapons, things like that, that quickly degrade, and then lead to obviously like more illness, sickness, and things like that. Sanitary agents are all white men and women. Christian Commission delegates, they were called, their volunteers, are also all white men. There were some Black Army chaplains, like Henry McNeil Turner, who are assigned to Black regiments. Black regiments are also commanded by white commanders. Yes, absolutely, Elise. The first volunteers in South Carolina is one of the first regiments that are formed during the Civil War in 1862. Thomas Wentworth Higginson is the commander of one of those South Carolina regiments, mostly organized by formerly enslaved men. But there is just incredible kind of limitation. So, for example, Black chaplains are paid $10 a month versus $100 for white chaplains. Black soldiers are paid $10 a month, same as the Black chaplains, but with their uniforms and costs deducted, whereas white soldiers are paid $13 plus extra for their uniforms and supplies. So there is just incredibly disparate treatment. And then also the kind of the longer conversation that takes place after the war about pensions, about relief for families, kind of contributes to that gap rising. Which is why we do see, I think one of the reasons we do see the formation of colored ladies sanitary commissions and ladies aid societies that do not want to send things to the sanitary commission, but want to send them directly to Black regiments because they do not trust that they are going to be distributed equally. The Colored Ladies Sanitary Commission of Boston is not affiliated with the Sanitary Commission, the United States Sanitary Commission, but takes on the moniker of Sanitary Commission in order to kind of reflect the goals and intentions of that organization as being the same, but directed towards, of course, the support of Black men and also freed communities. Harder to track, but was not a kind of equal distribution of resources and support, although they did receive, supplies and things in this period.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, definitely a fascinating talk. So thank you again for being with us today and to everyone for joining us. For those of you who registered, we will be also sharing the link to the recording. And for folks who didn't join us today. And for our next talk, we're actually going to take a break from talks in January and have our online trivia during the month of January. So that's a little bit fun. And then our next talk will be February 20th with Amy Godin on the Blackwoods about Black landowners in the Adirondacks. So we hope you will join us for that. Thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful day.